Okay, sorry, overtime, so I better get going. So today I'm talking to you about basically anarchy. The title in the program was probably designed so as not to shock people, but we're talking about anarchy. And I'm going to do it in the format of frequently asked questions, and then I'll, of course, leave time at the end for Q&A, and I imagine even after the talk, many of you are going to have questions, so I'll be available at that time. So the first question, and I'm going to be reading these in case people are listening to the audio, so they'll know what we're talking about. The first question is, can you define the terms, please? Now, this actually isn't a frequently asked question, but often when you start arguing with someone, you need to define the different terms. And since I'm making up a question, I decided to make it polite, and I put the word please in as well. So the most popular term for the people who are associated with the Mises Institute is probably anarcho-capitalism. And what that means is simply people who are a system where there is anarchy, meaning there's not a state. And so in the terms of just regular terminology, what's oligarchy? It's the political rule by a few, and monarchy is the rule by one. And so anarchy is rule by no one. All right, so that's what all anarchists, even left-wing anarchists, share in common, is that they think that there ought to be no political authorities. But then what's going on with that, adding the word capitalist there? Well, it's because the people associated with the Mises Institute who subscribe to this view, they are anarchists, so they don't believe in a political state, but they also support the system of capitalism or private property. And that's a distinction that needs to be made because people who also call themselves anarchists, many of them totally renounce capitalism, and they think private property itself is a form of authority where one group has special privileges over the masses. And so just as, so people with this mindset, they would say, look, just as monarchy is bad or even democracy is bad because the shifting coalitions, the people who are in power can then lord it over everybody else, in the same way, it's wrong to say this piece of property belongs to this individual or this group, or this company belongs to this group of shareholders and they have more rights or authority or power over how it's disposed of compared to the non-owners. And so they view capitalism as itself a system that's perpetuated by the state. And so for these people, they'll say things like, oh, anarcho-capitalism, that's just a contradiction in terms. All right, so I'm just making you aware of that. Some other terms that float around, I think Hans Hoppe says that he's a supporter of the natural order. All right, so he's trying to stress there that the state is not something that's natural, that perverts what would happen if people just had voluntary exchanges according to natural law, and so that's why I think he uses that term. There's also, lately my favorite term is to say that I believe in free market anarchy. And so I want to keep the word anarchy in there to make sure people don't misunderstand and they know I'm totally against the state, but I want to put the word free market in there because I think that's the easiest way, at least for an American audience, to get across what my view is, because most people understand the argument, oh, we should privatize education or privatize the roads. And so in a loose sense, what I am for is to privatize everything, or at least everything that ought to be provided. So I'm not for privatizing torture centers or gulags and things like that, which certain things that the state does, or taxation. But any legitimate service that the market could provide, I think, should be privatized, and the market ought to provide that. And so that's why I call myself a free market anarchist, because just to get across that, yes, I'm for the free market taken to its logical conclusion. Another term that I should also probably clarify the connection is libertarian. So, for example, Walter Block is a libertarian, and by that he means that he subscribes to the non-aggression axiom. So the non-aggression axiom says that everybody has the right to his or her property, and you can do whatever you want with your justly owned property so long as you don't aggress against anybody else's property. And so in and of itself, that seems a pretty innocuous thing to hold, and most people would generally say, well, of course I agree with that. But where the radicalism comes in is the extent to which Block would push that. And he would say, well, therefore you can't be for taxes because then you're aggressing against somebody else's property if you say you need to contribute X% of your income to fund national defense, and if you don't want to, well, then ultimately guys with guns are going to show up and take it from you. And so therefore, if you say you subscribe to the non-aggression axiom, you can't be for taxes, and so on with anything that's outside of a market nexus. So a question would be, is anarcho-capitalism the same thing as libertarianism? And I'll get to this point a little later on in the talk, but strictly speaking, no, or at least the way I'm going to use the terms, they're not. That libertarianism, in the sense that somebody like Walter Block means, would be a smaller category, would be a subset of all conceivable anarcho-capitalist systems. So in particular, we can imagine systems or societies that have private judicial systems where certain things happen that a libertarian in today's sense would say, I don't agree with that, and I don't think that's a feature of just law. All right, but like as I said, when we get to the legal aspects, this point will be clearer. So moving along, the next question, are all Austrians anarchists? No, they're not. I'm not sure, I don't want to name names for current people, but in particular Ludwig von Mises, in plenty of places in his writing, came out against anarchy. But even there, it's a little bit nuanced, because it's clear if you read his arguments, what he is considering as anarchy is the absence of law enforcement. So Mises says things in Human Action along the lines of, the anarchists believe that everyone would just peacefully get along if it weren't for the coercive institution of the state, but if society refuses to use force against those who would disrupt the social order, then we'll be at the mercy of these antisocial individuals. All right, so that type of argument shows that what Mises thinks anarchy is a society where there's no law enforcement. And so that's not what Murray Rothbard was proposing. So Rothbard was an anarchist, but he believed in law enforcement. And so what Rothbard's system is, for those of you who haven't really heard it, let me just quickly describe it. Rothbard thought that there would be competing private defense agencies, and so for example you'd have two individuals and they would subscribe to their own defense agencies, and if they had a dispute about something, if Jones thought that Smith stole his television set, he would ask him for it back and he would say no, and so then Jones would go to his own defense agency and say, I think that this guy over here stole my TV. They would have their own judicial proceedings and they would come up with a verdict, and they would invite the other guy to defend himself if he wanted to. But if that company thought that, yes, we agree with our client and this person over here took his television set, then they would proceed to go take it back. And then the question is, well, wait a minute, what about this other guy? And he has his defense agency, and then they would have their own judicial proceedings. And so the only problem would ever be, what if the two agencies disagreed with each other? Because, of course, if they both agreed, then it would be fine that the people who owned all the guns, or the majority of the guns in society, if they all agreed on a particular dispute, then the individual criminal isn't going to be able to stand up against them, so it wouldn't be a big deal in that case. But the problem is the alleged nightmare, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a later question, is, well, what would happen if those two agencies came up with different verdicts, where the agency representing the one client thought that our client is in the right, and the other agency thought, no, our client's in the right, and are they just going to be battling it out in the streets? And Rothbard thought, no, that's crazy. That would be very inefficient. That would be very costly. The agencies would have procedures, arbitration rules set up beforehand, where they would say, look, if we ever come up with different verdicts in a given case between our customers, then we'll turn to some third party, or we'll have some other procedure that will figure out what to do in that case. Because, of course, it's very costly to have battles with other agencies all the time. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's what Rothbard's view was. So it's clear, my point for going into it at this point is to show you that Rothbard was not naively saying we don't need law enforcement and we'll just trust everyone to get along and work everything out peacefully. That's not at all what he was saying. He was saying, yes, we do need law enforcement, and for the same reason that we need education and the government does a horrible job of educating people, in the same way we need law and the government does a horrible job establishing the legal rules and then enforcing them. And so that's why the market would do a better job. Okay, moving on. Wouldn't a neighboring state invade us? So if we formed an anarchist society, wouldn't we just be helpless for neighboring states coming in and taking us over? Or another way to frame the question would be to say, how could a free market provide national defense or provide defense services? So again, in this talk like this, I'm going to have to be very brief. But the first thing I want you to realize on this sort of question is the government does just as horrible a job when it comes to the military as it does in every other arena. Right? So it's not just a coincidence that the government is bad at curing the poverty, or the war on poverty is a failure, or the war on drugs is a failure. All right? That those sorts of things, most people, whether or not you think that the government ought to give up in those tasks, you can understand that it hasn't had very much success in them. And the same thing is true with the war on terrorism or the war on people trying to attack us. And the way this objection often runs is people will say, okay, give me a break. Let's say all of you anarchists at the Mises Institute, you secede from the U.S. and you say we're going to have our own little anarchist society here. Of course, we all know what's going to happen is once the government hears about it, they're going to send police officers, and maybe if we had enough weaponry here, we could repel the local police, or it wouldn't be in their interest to attack. But eventually, at some level of government, they're going to send enough troops here, and we're going to be either wiped out or arrested or what have you. And so doesn't that prove that, therefore, free market defense doesn't work? Now, that is a very silly objection, because by the same token, suppose we were a bunch of monarchists here, or even believers in democracy, and we just wanted to form our own little state. And Lew Rockwell centrally planned our defense and said, no, Bob, I want you to dig trenches, and Hans, I want you to go man the anti-aircraft gun, and so on. And we had our different ideas. Well, no, I don't think I should do that. I think my labor would be no. He said, no, we need to centrally plan the defense so we at least have a chance. No matter what we did, we would get wiped out by the U.S. government's forces. All right, so that particular scenario doesn't prove the relative efficacy of private or state versus private defense. So what a fair comparison, a good test would be is you want to take a country that could survive or repel a military invasion from a statist neighbor, and then because they had a government-controlled military, and then ask, okay, suppose that same society, instead of having the government centrally plan their defense, suppose they let there be competition in the industry of defense. And then how would those people fare? And so the anarchist claim would be that it's always better to organize your defense using voluntary market means rather than having one group impose their will on everybody else. So again, a different version of this, people always say things like, oh, come on, give me a break. If you had some tiny little anarchist country next to Nazi Germany, they would have gotten destroyed. They would have gotten taken over in a day. But by the same token, Nazi Germany didn't have too much trouble taking over plenty of state-controlled societies. All right? So the fact that Nazi Germany could be a particular anarchist country doesn't clinch the argument, because Nazi Germany also took over plenty of state-controlled societies. Now, so that's, of course, just to make sure you're making the right comparison, but still I haven't given you any hint as to, okay, well, exactly how would a free market in defense work? Well, very quickly, I think it would involve, at least for modern commercial societies, I think it would involve insurance companies. And so the idea is just picture first an area where there isn't much of a defense at all. There is no organized system where there's large companies that have huge aircraft carriers and they have all sorts of fleets of ships and so forth, and they have thousands of tanks. That none of that exists right now. We just have this very prosperous and wealthy anarchist area. They have tons of banks and all sorts of gold and valuable resources that their neighboring states want to seize. Now, in that environment, the people who own those things would be concerned about the fact that if troops are massing on the border, they're not stupid. They're going to realize we're going to be invaded any day now. And so what would happen? Well, of course, one thing is that people would just in their own capacity would go out and buy weapons. And so the sort of private resistance groups, or the insurrection that would happen if a group did try to come in and conquer them, would be far more effective than in relatively poor areas. So just to give you an example, of course it's obvious, look at how much trouble the U.S. forces are having in Iraq right now. Now imagine if the wealth and technological roles were reversed, because presumably in an anarchist society they're going to be, other things equal, wealthier and more technologically advanced than their neighbors who have states running things. And so the point is the private resistance there, the sabotage and so forth, would be far more sophisticated and advanced, other things equal. And so that right there would be a good deterrent. But I don't even think it would come to that, because what would happen is people would take out insurance policies for the case of military invasion. So if you were part of a company that owned a skyscraper, let's say, in an area that was like present-day Manhattan, and that you were an anarchist community there, and there was a neighboring state that was getting ready to start launching bombers to take out your city, to force you into submission. So there's a huge amount of damage there that could happen. You own billions of dollars of property, and so I think you would turn to the insurance company and they would give you a policy on it. And so how does the insurance company decide how much to charge you? Well, they would have to compute in some way. They couldn't necessarily use the methods of statistics as Hans Hoppe has pointed out in his lecture, because this is a unique historical event. But clearly, in order to figure out what to charge you, they would have to take into account some degree of the likelihood of how much damage would occur and how many bombers do we think they're going to send and so forth. And now the question is there anything that could change that equilibrium where they're charging very high premiums because invasion looks imminent? And I would say one thing the insurance companies could do is they could say, wait a minute, instead of just sitting here like sitting ducks and waiting for these guys to come and bomb us and then sending checks to our clients after the invasion occurs, why don't we take all this money that they're sending us in premiums, and why don't we go buy some anti-aircraft guns, or why don't we buy some fighter jets to knock down some of these bombers before they bomb our clients' property? And this isn't pure rhetoric or just whimsy on my part. Insurance companies right now do all sorts of things to encourage their clients to minimize property damage. So when I moved into the apartment here in Auburn and I wanted to get renter's insurance, the guy was asking me, okay, do you have a smoke detector? Do you have deadbolts and things like that? Do you have a fire extinguisher? And if so, we can give you lower premiums. So insurance companies right now do things like this to try to minimize the claims that they get. And so I don't think it's that far of a jump to assume in an environment where initially there were no large-scale defense being provided that insurance companies, if no one else were doing it already, could be the institutional mechanism that would fund that. And I think that's the biggest hurdle to free market defense, is to understand who would pay for all this stuff. And once you can understand roughly how it would work, then the rest is pretty straightforward. So we've got competing insurance companies buying services from defense agencies, giving them hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to provide the defense against bombers and invading troops and so on. Now, a couple things that would be different in a free market defense versus a government-run defense is that even in this framework, despite the threat of the enemy coming in, nobody would be allowed to violate property rights within the anarchist community. So just because the insurance company thinks they're acting to save everybody, and at the same time their own clients and their own bottom line, they wouldn't be able, for example, to just put mines all over the bridges into and out of the city, and then when the invaders' tanks come in just to blow up the bridges, and then to say, oh, see, we're saving the city. Well, they could do that, but they would have to contractually agree with the people who own those bridges beforehand, and they would presumably have to pay them for the right to blow up their bridges. Or they couldn't just impose a blackout so that the enemy bombers wouldn't know exactly where to go or to hit their targets at night. Or if they did want to impose a blackout, they would have to get permission to do that. They would have to agree and pay premiums to everybody to get them to agree to turn off their lights and so on. And in particular, they wouldn't be able to draft people into the service of defense. That they wouldn't be able to take people who didn't agree with it or thought, no, I'm not going to sacrifice myself to save your skyscraper. That's crazy. You do it yourself. They wouldn't be able to point the anarchist community's own guns at their own people and say, no, get out there and be a man and stand up for us. Okay, and of course that's what happens in state militaries often. And there's this misconception that all of these things I'm telling you would handicap the anarchist community. But on the contrary, that's exactly why they would be superior, because then the best techniques would be the ones over time that would prevail. And so in a conflict, a prolonged conflict with a statist military, the companies that were using resources more effectively would be the ones that would expand, and the ones that had a bad plan would go out of business. Just as in every other area of the market economy, you have competition. And so individual entrepreneurs do make mistakes, and it's just the profit and loss mechanism weeds them out. All right, just to give you a silly example, earlier this week, my infant son woke up very early and he wanted a banana, and we were out. And so I went to the store. I went to this very nice grocery store down the street, and they were just out of bananas. And I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. But that wasn't the end of the story. I just went 2 blocks over and went to a different grocery store, and they had bananas. All right. Whereas if you lived in the Soviet Union, it's possible that an entire city could be out of bananas for weeks on end. All right, because their food distribution and production was centrally planned, and so if somebody screws up, that means people go without. Whereas here, yeah, the people supplying that one store with bananas messed up, because what happened is they gave them bananas that they're already bursting, they were too ripe. And so, yeah, the people who went to that store were mildly inconvenienced. They had to go down the street. So what would be the analog of that when it comes to military defense? Well, what happened with France in World War II, right? They were building the Maginot Line. They drew the wrong conclusions from the lessons of World War I, and they thought, oh, World War I teaches us we need to have very heavily fortified forts, and we need to have tanks and so forth in formation there to repel the invaders, and let's start building this wall so that we'll be impregnable. And of course, we all know what happened. The Germans just went right around them. And so what I'm saying is, if France had had a private military industry, then yeah, maybe a few companies would have had that same idea, and they would have been building the wall, and they would have been charging insurance companies for that. They would say, look at what we're doing. We're going to prevent all sorts of claims against your clients, and in order for us to do this, we want you to pay us. And the insurance companies that thought it was a good plan would say, okay, yeah, and we'll do that. But there would be other people in the community who would disagree. They would say, no, our surveillance has shown us that the Germans they're really mobile at this point, and I don't think we should put all our eggs in one basket, so we're going to do something else. We're going to have snipers trained and put in post all through our cities, and we're going to just prepare for the long haul when the Germans come in, and we're just going to really just work over them on sabotage and things like that. And so the point is, you wouldn't be putting all of your eggs in one basket in terms of defending your country. All right, so the same reasoning that shows you why central planning in other areas doesn't work applies just as well when it comes to military defense. And the reason we tend not to think that, we think that, yes, the U.S. government is very inefficient and bloated when it comes to education and curing poverty and things like that, and building roads, but the U.S. government's really good at blowing stuff up and killing people. Like, our military is tough, right? But what does that mean? Who does our military fight? We fight other governments. And so, yes, the U.S. government is good at beating up other governments' forces, but that doesn't prove anything about the state versus anarchy. When it comes to fighting individuals, when it comes to taking out Osama bin Laden, the U.S. government is inept. Or if you're more cynical, you're going to think that, no, they're purposely letting him remain free because it suits their purposes. But that only strengthens my point, that the U.S. government is not good at keeping us safe from our enemies when the enemies are decentralized and, in a sense, private. Okay, and of course, there's tons of issues on this point, but I need to move on. Okay, another frequently asked question is, in a society like the one I'm proposing, wouldn't the defense agencies or the mafia or what have you, or the rich, take over? And the answer is yes, that's certainly possible. Let me deal with the mafia first, because that one's easier. So the mafia, I think that's a particularly silly worry that people have, that they say, no, we need to have a government because otherwise organized crime would take over. That because the mafia would extort money from us and occasionally kill people, that's why we need to have a government instead. Whereas I don't think the mafia ever takes 40% of people's income, or the mafia certainly doesn't terror bomb entire cities and have fire bombings and things like that, or have gulags and so on. And even you say, okay, yeah, those are tyrannical governments, but our government doesn't do stuff like that. Well, I've never heard of the mafia doing the equivalent of Waco to anybody. I mean, maybe in some countries the organized mafia does, but at least here I haven't heard about that. I certainly don't know, my own family, I don't know of any connection they've ever had where the mafia has ever extorted money from them, whereas everyone I know has had money taken from them by the U.S. government. All right, so that's one sort of humorous point, but the more serious response is to say, what regions right now is the mafia the most influential? And it's all those areas that are currently prohibited or heavily regulated by the government. So what is the mafia in right now? They're in narcotics, gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, and killing people, right? Those are some of the major areas, and those are all things that the government regulates. Now, in this talk, I can't go into why that's the case, but very quickly, if you just think about it, that if the government says, if we catch people in this particular occupation, we're going to arrest you, put you in jail, and then you're just going to be a social pariah. Everyone's going to know that you're an antisocial individual and you do things that are against the law. Is it any wonder then that over time the people who end up in those occupations are people who don't particularly fear being placed in jail, or people who would rather get the short-term gain of high monetary returns in exchange for the risk of going to jail? And that, in a sense, it's as if the government has declared war on pimps and prostitutes and people who charge exorbitantly high interest rates when they make loans. and that they send their own armed agents out to fight against those people. And so why is it surprising that over time those people become violent? Okay, and then the classic example, of course, is in the U.S. during alcohol prohibition, when the government made it illegal to sell and consume alcohol in certain public areas. Then all of a sudden gangs took over, and then there were drive-by shootings and things like that over who got the right to sell alcohol on this street corner. And then the government legalized it again, and then all that violence disappeared. That now it would be crazy to hear of employees of Budweiser gunning down employees of Coors or something. That just it wouldn't even make sense. All right, and so it's not because of the product per se; it's because of the prohibition. All right, so by the same token, then, if you just take the logic away, so what if we legalized gambling? Well, then I think the mob would get out of gambling. What if we legalized prostitution, and so on, all the way down the line, and then once you've legalized everything, and what we mean by legalized in this sense is that the U.S. government, if we're talking about the United States, doesn't use its force to try to prevent private individuals from engaging in this, well, then anarchy would in a sense mean that the government has legalized everything, even legislation and even law enforcement, and said, no, yeah, there can be competition in the police industry, and there can be competition in the legislative industry, if that's what you want to call it. And so in that sense, then I would say the mafia would largely disappear. Now, it's not that the individuals who are currently in organized crime would vanish. It's that the institutions and the incentives would change such that I think they would not find it profitable to be as violent as they are right now. But right now, the incentives are such that it really, if you have the courage and the stomach for it, you make more money by gunning down your competitors if you can get away with it if they're not too strong. Whereas that's not true of the CEO of beer companies right now. They don't sit down and say, what's our strategy? Well, we could spend more on advertising, or we could buy some AK-47s and shoot all these guys. That would never be profitable. So it's not merely that they happen to be nicer people than the people right now in the mafia. It's just that the incentives are such that would be crazy. It wouldn't be worth it. So in the same way, the incentives for all these other things would also change such that the mafia would not be a problem, or at least the mafia would evolve into something that was much more benign than is the case right now. Okay, a related objection is, wouldn't the defense agencies take over? So here I've described this situation where we've got all of these companies who own fleets of battleships, and they own aircraft carriers and all sorts of fighter jets and bombers perhaps, and isn't it naive to assume that they would just sit there and mind their own business and obey the property rights, at least in the anarchist community, and that they would only use that force to repel invaders? Wouldn't they, once they had built up their arsenal, wouldn't they turn the guns against their neighbors and exploit them? And so I think the easiest way to answer this is just to turn it around and say, well, why doesn't that happen with the state? That right now the U.S. government ought not to have a Navy and an Army because the Navy and the Army might take over, right? And Americans don't really fear that. That doesn't really seem like a realistic concern, but that certainly happens in other countries. There are plenty of, particularly in Latin America, plenty of countries where the military takes over the country, that overthrows the political ruler, and some general runs things. Okay, so it is a threat that could happen in an anarchist community, but by the same token, that can happen in any sort of society where there is a smaller group who has more force or more ability to use violence than other people do. And my claim would just be a relative one, that other things equal, if you have the stock of tanks and planes split up among competing agencies, then you're better off than if you took all of those tanks and guns and so forth and put them in the hands of one agency and said, now here, please take care of us, and in case any private individuals get too strong, then we want you to have all the tanks and guns to be able to knock them back down, and then so you don't harm us, let's write a Bill of Rights, and therefore now you can't touch us because we have this piece of paper that says what our rights are. I think that is far more naive than assuming that 20 or 30 competing defense agencies would all get together and exploit the community. Okay, moving on, how would a private legal system work? Okay, this is a fairly large topic, and that's why I left it to its own column there, because there's several related questions. So let me, and this is also the area where I think those of you in the audience who already are anarcho-capitalists may quibble with some of my points. So I want to postpone this at least until the middle of the talk. All right. Perhaps it's a coincidence, or maybe they did this on purpose, but yesterday on Mises.org, I had an article that came out about the possibility of private law, so there I talk in more detail about the stuff I'm going to mention very quickly right now. But ultimately, I think a private legal system, the basic foundation would be that when people have a dispute that they can't resolve on their own, they go to a judge, a private judge, and that occupation, what does a judge do? He or she renders an opinion, a legal opinion, on a particular case. So what needs to happen here, and why that's different from a state judicial system, is that under anarchy, or at least the type of anarchist system that I'm envisioning, that both parties to the dispute would have to agree beforehand on the judge that's chosen. And that seems, to some people that seems absurd, but there's all sorts of examples in history of when that has happened, where, for example, merchants in earlier times before governments really coordinated and had a system of law that could be applied in international commerce, when merchants from different companies would come together, or different countries would get together, and they were from different areas where the laws were different, and so if somebody stole something from somebody else or somebody cheated someone in their transaction, they couldn't just go back to their own courts and have it enforced because they wouldn't recognize the jurisdiction. That would be, you're from Spain and I'm from France, and so how are we supposed to have commerce? And they didn't just throw up their hands and say, therefore we can't deal with each other. No, what they would do is, in the case of dispute, they would turn to an arbitrator who was recognized by the community of traders and merchants as being someone very fair and objective, and that person would hear their dispute. They would both tell their side of the story and would render a very quick opinion, because the nature of commerce, you want to have things moving very quickly. You don't want something tied up in the courts for years on end. And then you say, well, what was the enforcement mechanism? Well, there really wasn't in terms of violence. It was just that if somebody went to the arbitrator, said his side of the story, the arbitrator ruled in favor of the other party and said, yes, I do think that Jones defrauded Smith here in this transaction, and that Jones needs to pay 1,000 pounds of silver in order to make up for it. If then Jones says, no, you're crazy, you don't know what you're talking about, that didn't happen, and so I'm not paying, he could do that, and no armed people would come and take his property. But what would happen is the other merchants would hear about that and say, okay, I'm not going to deal with him in the future, or I'm not going to get into a long-term contract with him at the very least. That maybe if he comes up and shows me things that I can inspect their quality on the spot, I'll trade with him then, but I'm not at all going to leave myself vulnerable because he's shown that he won't abide by the decisions of the reputable arbitrator. Okay, so that's, I think, the fundamental starting point of a private legal system, is that individuals would voluntarily submit themselves to a ruling, an opinion rendered by somebody who, through past experience, had proven that he or she was very judicious in their interpretation of the law. And you say, okay, but where does the law come from? How do they even know what principles to use? And that's a very complicated topic, and of course, in this sort of talk, I can't get into it too deeply. But in a sense, that's like saying, well, how do people know how to write grammar books? How do they know what the rules of grammar are? Do the people who write dictionaries, do they just invent what words mean? Well, no, they don't. They codify what the prevailing norms are. All right, so there is a definite right and wrong to grammar right now, that you can write a sentence and somebody who's educated can objectively say, no, that's grammatical, or yes, that's perfectly grammatical. And so there are rules of grammar, and yet they also evolve over time, and they're a product of humans. It's not something that just comes straight out of the laws of physics. It has to do with human communities, and there are different grammars, different languages for different people, but yet even within those different regions there are certain rules that people can recognize. All right? So it's objective in that sense. It's not purely arbitrary. It's not that you can say whatever you want and say, I make it grammatical, but at the same time there is a sense in which the community as a whole, the norms can evolve over time. So let me, again, I don't want to spend too much time, but let me deal with one objection that people have had when reading my booklet on this topic. They thought that unless you have a system of law in your head that you think is just law, and then you want to argue that the market would somehow enforce that therefore you're a legal positivist, meaning that you're just a nihilist. You say, there's no such thing as objectively correct law, and whatever the profit and loss test gives us is therefore a good legal system. And that's not really what I'm saying. Maybe other people would say that, but that's not my position. But My concern is with certain theorists. For example, Murray Rothbard wrote The Ethics of Liberty, and in there he starts with the non-aggression axiom and tries to deduce step by step what a body of just law would be. And then he's going to say, this is what law ought to be in the libertarian society. And how do we get there? It's when all the judges or the great majority recognize this. And it's not just Rothbard spinning stuff off the top of his head. He thought it was flowing from natural principles, that it was a form of natural law. And that when the judges, if they ever did accept this and then apply it in their rulings, then we would have, at long last, a truly just society where the legal system would be correct. And it's not that I think that's wrong, but I think it overlooks the role of a division of labor, and that no individual can possibly sit down and just, through ratiocination, just spell out and logically deduce the entire body of just law. That I think there's a give and take, and that there's certain things that you might spell out a principle, and then a situation would arise where you'd realize that principle really isn't a good one and it needs to be altered. So just to give you an example, and for those who haven't read Rothbard on this, I apologize. You're going to lose me a little bit here, but I know there are plenty of people here who are experts in this area. So just to clarify, what do I mean? So suppose we had the Great Awakening, and everyone reads The Ethics of Liberty and they love it, and everyone just stops supporting the government, and we have a libertarian community in the Rothbardian sense. And how do we know what's the standard or the criterion for compensation or punishment in the case of theft? So Rothbard has this idea of, I think Walter Block may have coined the term of 2 teeth for a tooth, and the argument runs as follows. Look, suppose somebody steals my television set, and all the agencies all agree that, yep, he objectively stole it. There's no doubt about that. Now, what am I entitled to? Well, for sure, I get my television set back, but do I get anything else? Can I cut the guy's head off, for example? And you say, well, no, you can't do that. That would be using excessive force. That would be a punishment that was disproportionate to the crime. So what can you do? Well, Rothbard says you can do to that person what he did to you. So since he stole your television set, you get your TV back, and then you can steal his television set also, right? But you can't do more than that. And then there's some variations where they say you can also take what the cost of the judicial proceedings, and then the armed agents that had to go and get the television sets and so forth. So you actually get a little bit more than 2 TVs. But you understand where he wanted to establish there needs to be some sort of limit on compensation or punitive damages, because you can't just have people shooting each other for minor infractions. Okay, so that's, and hence the principle 2 teeth for a tooth, related to the Old Testament, a tooth for a tooth. So suppose the judges initially are applying this, and everybody says, yeah, that seems great. Well, what would happen, and let me just, as an aside, mention, whenever libertarians start arguing about legal issues, for some reason, they always end up gravitating towards cases of rape. And I don't know if that's just because most libertarians are adolescent boys, and that's an example that pops into their head. But this is one case where I think it actually is appropriate. I'm not just picking rape because it popped. I think it really, well, you'll see what my point is here. Suppose somebody in the anarchist community, some guy goes and rapes a supermodel, and then she brings charges against him, and the judge says, okay, so he raped you, so now as punishment you have to go rape him twice. All right? I think in that situation you can realize that if he made that ruling, the people would say, well, wait a minute, that Rothbardian principle doesn't really ring true in this case. It doesn't strike me as being very just. Okay? And so if he did make that ruling, and this is the way I think the legal system and the laws would evolve, is that so then the supermodel hears that opinion, and she says, no, I was hoping for some monetary compensation. I don't want to just have the ability to rape him twice, and then the defense agencies aren't going to interfere. They're not going to stop me from doing that, and that's what it means to say my rights have been served. So then she could just take it to a different judge, some judge who thinks that Rothbard's system at that particular point is inadequate, and he has some different principle. And I don't know what the principle is. All right, I don't think I would be a professional judge in an anarchist community. I also don't think I'd be a professional musician, but I'm not sure what I would be. But I don't think I would be a judge. But I do know that I, as a customer, as someone in that community, when I heard these different rulings and the supermodel went to the other and said, I'm not going to obey that ruling, I'm going to go over to a different judge and try to get a different verdict against that particular person. And then he said, yes, I think that he owes you whatever it is, 500 ounces of gold. And then she goes to a defense agency, and they also agree with that particular judge, and then they send their armed troops over and take 500 ounces of gold from that guy and give it to her as compensation. So how would these conflicts happen? Because the other person could say, what are you talking about? We went to that first judge, and he didn't say that I owed you any money, and so what's the story? You can't be sending troops over, so maybe he could go to his defense agency. And so what would have to happen, I think, is that the community overall, just through the interaction of who supported which side, indirectly would foster a situation where, in ridiculous cases like that, I don't think the defense agencies would find it profitable to enforce rulings that everybody just thought was absurd, because then they would get a bad name. All right, so thinking about it from the defense agency's point of view, when they use their troops or their employees, we should probably stop using military metaphor, when they use their employees to enforce judicial rulings that necessarily involve force, the public opinion would come into play. And that's something that I think people overlook. And another point that I want to emphasize is that the legal system and the enforcement of it are conceptually distinct. All right, and so I think even many Rothbardians have this idea that the defense agency would enforce that type of justice that its owners believed in and nothing else. And I think that's wrong. I think just as in an anarchist system, the mail delivery companies would deliver all sorts of mail, even the contents of which they didn't agree with. In the same way, I think the enforcement agencies, the people who have guys who are sharpshooters and have body armor and so on, as long as it was a judicial ruling that the community largely agreed with that particular arbitrator's opinion, they would go and enforce it. And so if two Orthodox Jews are arguing over here and they go to a rabbi and he applies something from Deuteronomy and says, yep, that guy needs to get his hand chopped off, then the Acme Defense Agency sends a guy over there with an axe and chops his hand off. And then these people over here have a dispute, and they're both Rothbardians, and they have the ethics of liberty applied by a Rothbardian judge and say, okay, you need to give him 100 ounces of gold. Then that same defense agency, acting on behalf of this customer, might go and enforce that. So it's not that they would just have to pick which legal system do we agree with and then go and enforce that. Okay, I need to move on. Oh, one last thing on this point, because I promised I'd come to it earlier. So as I describe that system, the objection is, or the worry is, well, couldn't there be all sorts of unjust things that survive the profit and loss test in that proposal, that you're talking about prevailing legal norms and relative military strength of the different defense agencies, and when would it be profitable to enforce something, and so on. And yeah, perhaps over time norms would emerge that we would agree with, but isn't it at least possible something horribly unjust could survive? And the answer is yes. And for example, right now, if the entire U.S. went anarcho-capitalist, I think abortion would probably be legal. I don't think that armed men would be able to go up to an abortionist and do to him whatever they could do to somebody who's an axe murderer. Okay, and I personally think abortion is murder, and I'm just saying I think that's what would happen. Just empirically judging on the opinions of Americans and what I think their relative views are, I don't think abortion would be legally punished, at least tomorrow, if the U.S. went anarcho-capitalist. Maybe over time, because you could argue that the government supports or promotes abortion perhaps indirectly through its policies, and that with that were taken away, that the natural result would be a society where abortion weren't legal. In particular, if you could, when you were giving up a child for adoption, if you could in a sense give the baby to the highest bidder, then there wouldn't be, and that's like, oh my, that sounds horrible, but then there would probably be a lot fewer abortions, right? If you could, prospective couples who wanted to adopt a child, if they could pay you thousands of dollars for that, then people right now who are considering abortion would realize, well, if I do take the child to term, I could in effect sell the baby on the baby market and get more money that way. All right, so anyway, I'm not saying that there would be more abortions if we went anarcho-capitalist, but I'm just saying if that's possible, and does that mean therefore I would say, oh, well, if it's profitable, that means abortion's okay? No, I'm not saying that at all. Or perhaps a better example, in the 1850s, if there were an anarcho-capitalist theorist and he were arguing for his system, an abolitionist could quite rightly point out, if we took your proposal and got rid of the U.S. federal government, even the state governments, isn't it possible, at least in the southern regions, slavery would be recognized by the private judges, that the private judges down there would probably rule that yes, those individuals are the rightful property of these other individuals, and wouldn't that be enforced just as, you know, the cows or whatever would be considered property of some other human being? And that probably would be true also, at least for a short while. And again, so it's not that, oh, therefore slavery must be okay. I don't think that at all, but I'm just honestly saying I think that's what would happen. But at the same time, I think slavery would be eradicated much more quickly under that proposal than it was under the statist setup. And just you say, well, how would that happen? Well, for example, there were laws against manumission or limiting them, so the ability of when someone dies to free his slaves on his deathbed, that there were regulations trying to limit that. There were also certain regulations against educating your slaves, because the local governments didn't want all the slaves to become educated, because then they could read books and get bad ideas in their head and rise up, and so better to keep them all ignorant. Whereas any individual, if you want your slave to teach your children or something, of course it's in your interest to teach them how to read and write and so forth. And so, or another example would be when you had runaway slaves, and then the government forces would go and capture them and bring them back. What was happening was that the taxpayers, even non-slave holders, were funding the recovery of runaway slaves. Whereas in a private system, of course, that wouldn't happen, so the true cost of slavery would be brought to bear much more heavily on the slave owner. So I think that it would very quickly have been eradicated, but it is possible that overnight, if they went anarcho-capitalist in 1840, the private judicial system would recognize slavery. So again, it's an analogy I use is when it comes to education, I could argue against the government monopoly on education and say what I think would happen in a free market, and then someone could say, oh, well, what if all the people or all the parents in a certain region are really stupid or they're evil, and they only send money to schools where they teach their children the wrong times tables? And couldn't that happen? And yes, if it were profitable, then schools in a private system would teach children the incorrect times tables, but it's also possible that a government system could teach bad things, and we think that happens right now. It's just, I don't think that's very likely. All right, so it's the same type of thing here. As an economist, I can tell you the forces I think that would shape a private legal system. It doesn't mean I necessarily endorse everything that would pop out. Okay, let's very quickly go through these remaining objections or questions. So aren't political institutions put in place by God? And in particular, I believe it's Paul's epistle to the Romans, where he says that, you know, do what the authorities tell you to do, and if you've been done right, if you've been righteous, then you have nothing to fear from them, and if the authorities are persecuting you, then it's because you did something wrong. And it's all I want to say at this point on this particular question is there are certainly examples where even the most diehard right-wing religious conservative is not going to think that this applies to a particular ruler. So most evangelical Christians fully supported Bush's invasion of Iraq, and it would not have deterred them to say, well, wait a minute, don't you think God put Saddam Hussein in charge of the Iraqis, and so who are we to interfere with God's plan? They would have thought that was silly. Or you can even take more extreme examples like Stalin or Hitler, and that most people would not think that some of the passages in the New Testament therefore mean that we can't use any sort of means to oppose those particular rulers. All right, so that's not a great answer. If there is somebody out there who says, yes, that's true, that they shouldn't have attacked Saddam Hussein, that all government rulers are put in place by God and you shouldn't oppose them, then that would at least be a consistent position, and I'm not going to go into what you could possibly say against that right now, but most people who say this sort of objection don't think it would apply to government rulers that they dislike. It just means the government rulers they like, don't mess with them because they were put in place by God. Okay, another common question is, aren't we always, or are we never, in anarchy? So the never one's fairly easy. So these people are going to say, look, no matter what sort of social arrangement we have, there's always some group that's in charge or that has more influence than others. And so isn't that a system of authority, and therefore we're never in anarchy? And if that's what your definition is, then yeah, that's probably true, but that's not what I'm advocating when I say I'm an anarchist. I mean, I'm against the state, in particular the institution that claims a rightful monopoly on the use of force in its boundaries and the right to be able to tax people, to fund its activities and raise the revenue from that, even from people who aren't subscribing customers. All right, and so that's what I mean by anarchy, and no, we're not always in that situation. We're not in it right now. And then the other common question is, aren't we always in anarchy? And so this, when people say this, they get real philosophical and say, in a sense, don't we all do what we want to do given the constraints that we face? And so in a sense, aren't we all just doing that which you say would happen in an anarchist framework? And it's just we happen to subscribe to these agencies that we call the government. And so aren't we always in anarchy? And no, I don't think so. I think that that's a confusion. And one way to see that is the people who say that, I think if you caught them in a different conversation and said, hey, do you think that we should just have a total free market and let the free market do everything? They would probably say, oh, no, of course not. That would be crazy. We need a government. All right, so those sorts of people, like I said, they don't really think that the government is a state of anarchy, and I think it just sort of proves that they're inconsistent when they're trying to argue from one approach. And on this point, another way to see it is I don't think most people in the U.S. really believe that the federal government owns everything, including their bodies, and that they're just tenants on the government's property. And so hence when people say, hey, if you don't like our system here, you can get out, and therefore everything here is voluntary, I don't think that's really an accurate argument, because most people really don't think that. They don't think that, yeah, the government has the right to draft me for military service because really George Bush owns my body, and he's just permitting me right now to go about my business, but he has the right to do that because he's ultimately the owner of me. I don't think people think like that, and they really do think that, no, I own my house and so on, and then the government under certain situations can interfere with my property rights. And so if that's your mentality, then you're not a free market anarchist. Okay, the second last question, how do we get there? One thing I think is not necessary and would be counterproductive is violent insurrection. And I'm not just saying that because we need to say that so we don't get in trouble. That it's truly the way you would get to, let me put it this way, the only way an anarchist system would be sustainable, and this is another question that's frequently asked that I didn't put up here, the other question being, well, wouldn't the state just reemerge in your system, or how do we prevent that? And it would require the vast majority of people to, if you're a libertarian, you would say to subscribe to the non-aggression axiom, or I would just put it more simply that most people in the society would need to say we should not violate people's property rights who aren't criminals. And that's not true of today's society. As I said, this relates to the last point, that right now people, they might say to you, oh yeah, sure, we shouldn't violate people's property rights. And then you say, okay, so if I don't want to pay taxes to fund the Iraq War, I shouldn't have to, right? And they say, well, no, you need to be able to pay yours. We can't just have everyone deciding what to pay for. That would be crazy, right? So those people really don't mean it when they say, I think people shouldn't have their property rights violated. So that's all we need in order for anarchy to be sustainable. And so by the same token, I think that's how we get there, is we just need to convince a sufficient number of people to withdraw their consent from political statist institutions, and then we can have anarchy. And the use of violence not only doesn't get us there, but I think is counterproductive. That, I mean, just look at how much more power George Bush and his cronies have after September 11th. All right, so from a technical point of view, the terrorists on September 11th had a great victory. I mean, that was amazing what they were able to do with only 19 people, and so surely that should have helped them. But no, if their goal was to get the U.S. out of the Middle East, that completely backfired on them. They did the exact opposite. The U.S. then had a pretext to invade. All right, and so by the same token, if your goal is to get people to withdraw their support from the U.S. federal government, the last thing in the world you want to do is blow up a federal building, because then everyone gets sympathy for the federal government and thinks all of those right-wing militants are crazy and that we need to round them up. Okay, so that's how I think we get there, is through persuasion. And then finally, where can I read more? Roderick Long actually has a good talk. If you go to Mises.org, the media and the archives section, he's got a talk. What is it? Frequent objections to anarchy?
10 frequent objections.
Okay, I would point you there. Hans Hoppe has a pamphlet down there, The Private Production of Defense, and then his book, The Myth of National Defense. I personally have plenty of articles. This has been my summer of anarchy here at the Institute on Mises.org. The daily articles, if you look at my archives, there's plenty of stuff there. There's also, this just happens to be here, chaos theory, which the point of this, what I had in mind when I wrote this is I wanted something that in a frat bathroom could just sit on the toilet, and so that everybody, they would just pick it up. And so if you think that it belongs next to a toilet, then it was successful. Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty is a great place to start. If you're an objectivist, then Linda and Morris Tannehill's The Market for Liberty is a good place. And finally, if you're a utilitarian in your ethical views, then David Friedman's The Machinery of Freedom is a good place to go. So a lot of them make the same points, but coming at it from a different angle. And I should stop at this point and open it up for questions. Yeah.
How do you solve the other two common questions of the mercenary army, how keeping them from just switching to the other side when they pay more, and why would they put their life on the line when they can't take the money they're getting for it with them? And then also with the wall and the insurance company analogy, what would not only would they be tempted, they'd actually have a profitable incentive to be the best insurance company is going to be the one that can convince the other insurance companies to build the wall without them contributing, because then they'll be able to offer cheaper premiums. So how do you solve the freeloader problem?
Okay, well, so there's actually two questions there. So the first was, what do you do? How could you prevent when an invading army comes in? Why wouldn't they just pay the mercenary troops from the private defense agencies more to turn their guns on the domestic population? And again, there's always the relative argument. Well, the same thing would plague a state military. That how do you keep the members of the U.S. Army from turning over and joining the resistance and attacking their own units, or something like that? And anything in terms of propaganda or ideology that governments use right now to try to convince their soldiers that they're fighting on the right side could be applied all the more so in a free market community, I think, because they could rightfully tell their people, look at we're the most peaceful society on the planet, and these people over here, they have drafts and they have horrible prisons and things like that, and we don't have any of that here, so why would you fight for them against us? And also the relative wealth, that other things equal, I think the anarchist community would be richer, and so they'd be able to pay more. Then the other question was the free rider problem, and why would the insurance companies contribute if they could just not pay and let other companies do it? I get into this in my book a little bit more in depth. The quick answer is, according to that logic, no one would ever fund defense, or defense would be horribly underfunded, and then we'd be sitting ducks for invaders. But then that also wouldn't be an equilibrium. That if that's the case, it would be worth it for at least one company to fund the defense and save its customers. And so what if other companies free ride on that? That's at least it would get done. And the other thing to point out is, when it comes to these free rider and efficient provision of services issues, it's not an all or nothing thing. That how am I trying to say that? It's so inefficient to just sit there and not spend a little bit on an anti-aircraft gun. Like, in other words, the damage you could prevent by knocking down incoming bombers is so much more in monetary terms than what it costs to build it, that even if there are huge inefficiencies in the neoclassical sense, that doesn't mean it's not going to get built. All right, so that would be my other response. Yeah.
I think regarding that, Mike, if you had it's like saying in France, if there was an anarcho-capitalism, insurance companies could sort of contract with each other at kind of reinsurance, where if one of them chooses to engage in a wall building project or something, that turns out to be a great idea and it works really well. And the other ones, after an invasion happens, end up having to pay that insurance company some significant sum of money. So that kind of internalizes the externalities.
Right. So what he was pointing out is that various contractual arrangements could spread the costs and agree to stuff beforehand, and that's true. But and I agree with that, and I talk about that in my book. But the critic could then just say, okay, but wouldn't some loan agency not join that contractual arrangement? And yeah, they could. But the point is, it would never be an equilibrium for no one to do any funding. And if it is true that yes, the big companies would go ahead and fund the wall or the anti-aircraft turrets, and then some freeloader company would come into there and sort of free ride off of that, that's possible, but at least the stuff would get built. All right, let me take one more, and then I'll let you guys go, and then we can, you can ask me afterward. Yep.
That's what topic for judges. If you were wrong, most likely going to the judge would be most favorable to your cause and place the maximum punishment.
Oh, so the question is, why wouldn't people just go to the judge that they thought would most likely give a verdict favorable to them? Because in order for because the whole essence of the system is both parties have to agree on the arbitrator.
Criminal that harms you, and would he have to agree to the judge too?
Yes, and if he didn't, right, yeah. So I get in this more on the article that just ran yesterday on Mises.org. But yeah, so if somebody comes up and attacks me and I want to take him to court and I say, look, here's a list of 14 judges in the area that specialize in this area, and you pick any one of them and I'll take my case there because I caught you on tape and I know you're guilty, and that person says, no, I'm not going to do it, well, then the community would know, okay, that person, there's this outstanding allegation of a crime, and he's refusing to go to all these arbitrators that we all know are perfectly fair, and so we think that guy's probably guilty. And so the community would probably respond by not letting him shop in their stores, because this is now a criminal walking around, or a suspected criminal that is refusing to go to arbitration. All right, so yes, the community would have to respond differently in that system than they do right now, where they just assume, no, the government will take care of criminals. People would have to be a little bit more wary. But I think once people made that adjustment, then the system would be much better. Okay, let me stop and let you guys go, and then I'll entertain questions afterwards. So thanks.